Thank you for waiting. We are in the last session today. Today we have a demonstration debate by 4 experienced debaters, and they are actually helping us as assistant instructors in this workshop. They have different backgrounds, and so before starting the debate per se, I'd like to ask debaters to briefly introduce themselves. But the idea for this session is, one, listen to the whole debate, and if you haven't seen the whole debate yet, the full format, familiarize yourself with the format. And so you listen to the debate, take notes, and decide based on your judgment. Do not include your personal opinion, but based on the argument you hear, decide. Probably we will ask for your decisions. Okay, so without further delay, I'd like to welcome the introduction of each speaker and then go on to the debate process. Okay?
Hi, my name is Cynthia. I will be the first affirmative speaker from the first affirmative speaker.
So that's Cynthia.
My name is Marlon.
No, you know Marlon.
I'm Scott. I'm the second negative speaker.
Hi, my name is Mark. I'm the first negative speaker.
Ladies and gentlemen, an eye for an eye makes the world blind. This is the line that I would like to start from the affirmative of today's debate. And because we think that today's modern days Japan has moved into a modern and civilized society, therefore we don't think cruel death penalty is no longer needed. In today's debate, the affirmative is going to prove to you 5 things. Firstly, that the death penalty carries no extra deterrence effect than life imprisonment. And secondly, that life in prison without parole has served its 3 purposes of a justice system: punishment, deterrence, and rehabilitation, all at once. So we don't think death penalty is needed anymore. Thirdly, we think inherently death penalty is morally and ideologically unjust for the society has moved so far. Fourthly, we don't like to incentivize or give the state the right to kill its own people by punishing the people who have done the same wrong. So lastly, we think abolishing death penalty will improve the Japan and EU relation in the long run. So we think it's inherently beneficial and brings a larger impact to the society in the future. So firstly, let me move on to the no death penalty carries no extra deterrence effect. According to Howard from Munich University, April 2007, that researchers has been unable to find a credible correlation between the death penalty and reduced homicide rates. For example, in Canada, homicide rates were lower after death penalty was abolished in 1993. So we think, and there's also a lot of researchers and commentators has noted a tendency for murderer to actually increase in several particular locations after an execution occurred there. So we think that numerous research has told us in EU and in Canada, in those countries where death penalty were abolished a few years ago, that there is no significant surge in homicide rate or whatsoever in terms of crime rates. So we don't think that there is a necessary correlation in the modern and civilized society for death penalty to carry this extra deterrence effect. We think, ladies and gentlemen, back a couple hundred years ago, when we're back in the Rome state, when you steal a piece of gold, that people chop your hands off. That's when we think that the people are unable to be educated. They are unable to comprehend why the law exists and why people should go by with the law. But we think today's modern society, particularly in Japan, when the literacy rate is almost 100%, and when the society has advanced so much, we don't think this is necessarily the issue anymore. So we think that the death penalty is no longer needed for this extra deterrence effect. Then let's talk about the alternative of life imprisonment without parole. We think the purpose has been served if we keep the criminal, no matter how evil this person was, in prison for the rest of their life without any chance for him to come out. So he has been punished for the rest of his life, and his criminal activity or whatsoever would not be able to carry out again to the society. He has been segregated from the society, therefore not being able to endanger the society anymore. And also, we think that if we actually keep him alive, there's a better chance. Of course, there's the chance for him to actually realize his guilt and contribute back, or being rehabbed into a useful person to the society. Even if he is just in jail, he can still contribute back to the society if he has been rehabbed. On the other side, it's very easy to see if you killed him, nothing could ever happen afterwards. So we think let's move on to the third argument of how death penalty is morally unjust inherently. I think from quotation from the EU Minister and Deputy Head of Delegation, Michael Redford, that EU has against death penalty ever since the very draft of the Constitution for EU, that everyone has the right to life. No one shall be condemned to death penalty or executed, and no one shall even be removed, expelled, or extradited to a state where there is a risk for them being killed in these other countries. So therefore, that means if there's any case that relates to Japan and EU will refuse to extradite that particular person back to Japan because there is a risk for him to be killed in Japan, where EU strongly stand against for death penalty. So we think that also wind into my fourth argument, that how abolishing death penalty will help EU and Japan to review its relation and move up the relation to the next level. According to John De Burrow from University of Tokyo, Japan's maintenance of death penalty and the inhumane condition on death row serve as an obstacle to close relations between EU and Japan. These two parties has already moved on shared many common value and have committed themselves to protect human rights for a long run. But the consistence and insistence of Japan keeping death penalty has become an issue for preventing Japan taking the opportunity to reaffirm its international commitment and for further strong partnership with EU to be built. So we think after Japan getting rid of this death penalty, which is no longer needed so much, the relation between Japan and EU will be enhanced. And my second speaker would be happy to talk about why we do not want to give state the right to kill its own people. And I'd like to conclude my speech by saying that since death penalty doesn't carry its actual effect anything inhumane, and then it prohibits Japan to build a further relation with EU, we think that we're very, very proud to propose.
Okay, I know you said your partner would talk about it in the next constructive, but if the state has the ability to prevent a violent crime, is it their moral obligation to act and prevent it?
Please tell me why life in prison does not prevent a violent crime if we have already captured a criminal.
Well, no, my question isn't necessarily about a comparison of the death penalty or life in prison. My question is just, does the state have are they required to act to prevent violent crime?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Okay. So if you said that repealing the death penalty can improve EU-Japanese relations. do the EU and Japan cooperate on any issues currently?
Yes, they do.
Okay. And your evidence also talks about how they also want the U.S. to repeal the death penalty. But Japan also currently works with the U.S. on many issues.
Don't you think that relation will be better if this get rid of?
Well, I guess that kind of leads into the central portion of my question, which is what additional things would this improvement in relations lead to? Like, what additional benefits would there be? I guess. Because if we're working together now, I guess I'm not sure what the improvement in relations would bring.
Perhaps the improvement is to improve Japan international reputation in terms of become a more humane society.
Okay. You also talked about it's better to rehabilitate criminals. I guess I have two questions on this. First, if life in prison without parole is the alternative, what is the purpose of rehabilitating somebody who will never be released from prison?
Like I briefly explained in my speech, a person doesn't have to be useful when they're in the society. He can be still contributing to the society when he is in the prison.
Okay. And my second question is that since it is fairly common for people who have committed one crime, particularly one as violent as murder or rape or robbery, to commit a second crime, is it possible that these attempts at rehabilitation would fail and that if these criminals are released, they would just go back to committing the same crime they committed in the first place?
I agree. Therefore, we are not giving them the parole.
Okay, so you advocate that anyone who would receive the death penalty, they automatically would just get life without parole?
I think so, yes.
Okay. You also say that, going back to the question of whether or not states can deter violence, does your evidence indicate specific ways in which life without parole can deter violence? I guess I'm not exactly sure why it would have the same effect that the death penalty would have.
I think if you're talking about deterrence in terms of the same individual committing the crime again, they will not be out to the society again. So I think that deterrence has been done. For the deterrence for the society, I think my second speaker will be happy to talk about that.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the primary purpose of our justice system is the protection of society and the dispensation of justice. And while we agree with Cynthia here that our society now is moving towards a more civilized, modern version of itself than it used to be, we have to recognize, and the reality that they have to contend with, is that our society now has become far more dangerous than it used to be in the past. When you talk about bombings that brought down your Twin Towers in the US, when you talk about coordinated attacks in Tokyo, such as the ones we had in 1995 called the Sarin bomb attack, such as the ones that we have in Indonesia, where terrorist organizations are already growing and have already bombed and undertook a series of attacks that have brought thousands of lives on the line, the question is, what is the most commensurate and effective response that the state must undertake? And this is the context with which we enter this debate. This is the reason why we think that we shouldn't abolish the death penalty in Japan. What are we going to talk about in this debate? The first thing we're going to talk about is the benefit that we would get from death penalty while still having death penalty. The second thing I'm going to talk about is why abolishing it wouldn't happen anytime soon, and that there would be more harms than benefits if we abolish it. But before I move to my constructive, I'd like first to knock down the arguments brought about by Cynthia. The first is that Cynthia talked about how there's no additional deterrence effect in death penalty, and that it's better to rehabilitate criminals or murderers. We have two responses to this. Number one, we have to recognize that terrorists or serial killers are beyond rehabilitation. You can't just expect these people to change inside the prison and then just take away the ideology that has driven these people to put thousands of lives on the line in a variety of countries. And we know that terrorism and terrorists are beyond rehabilitation. The second level of attack is that in which scenario are we better able to deter criminals? In a scenario where you don't have death penalty, or in a scenario where these criminals could still roam around inside prisons, make friends, and eat, right? So if we have a comparative look to that, we think that we are better, and in terms of likelihood, there's a higher likelihood that we deter criminals from doing bad things in our scenario. The second argument I'd like to engage is that they would want to have a life without parole. Our response to this is very simple. We think that this contradicts the principle of a modern and a civilized society. When we have criminals spending the rest of their lives inside prison, not knowing whether they would go out or not, we think that we subject them to a variety of brutal realities inside their prison cells, such as being ganged up by their inmates, such as being raped, or sometimes even being killed or thrown inside prison cells. We think that this contradicts the humane society that you want, and in fact prolongs the agony of these individuals if you really want to protect their humanity. This is where I move on to my first argument on deterrence. According to Shimbun 2013, Japan needs to be prepared to deal with the expansion of terrorist activities across national borders. Japanese citizens should no longer consider ourselves impervious. In fact, according to the professor of law in Emory University, Shepard 2007, research shows that capital punishment deters every kind of murder that has been studied. This includes many kinds of murderers, like terrorists, who might not seem to be deterrable. And his own paper found out that death penalty has a deterrent effect on all categories of murder, including crimes of passion and intimate murders that many people think are undeterrable. Second, capital punishment could have an overall deterrent effect on terrorism, even if many terrorists are not influenced by capital punishment. To give a deterrent effect, all that is necessary is that a small fraction of terrorists are deterred. Obviously, the death penalty does not deter all murders, but it deters a small important fraction of them. News accounts are replete with accounts of alleged terrorists who find strenuously in court to get life imprisonment instead of death penalty. These terrorists obviously view execution as a worse penalty than life in prison. If executions are a harsher penalty, then some terrorists should be deterred by them. Technological advances threaten to outdo anything terrorists have done before. Super-terrorism has the potential to eradicate civilization as we know it. To cause great harm to millions of people, an extreme person will need only dangerous knowledge. Unlimited development of knowledge henceforth puts us all in clear extinction. Second argument is on Japanese politics. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe is supporting more nuclear power right now. 70%, according to Shimbun 2013, of voters want to see an end to nuclear power generation in Japan. 60% of Japanese want to use nuclear energy to terminate by the end of 2030s. Politicians are currently showing little interest in holding in-depth discussions for building a society that is not dependent on nuclear energy. Abe has also advocated the reduction in Japan's dependence on nuclear power. However, his administration appears to be tilting towards changing the direction from reduction to promotion of nuclear energy. So the government forbids the release. This simply meant, ladies and gentlemen, that death penalty repeal is a political suicide because it harms Shinzo Abe's political capital in forwarding his policy regarding nuclear energy. Because the public loves death penalty and has been, on a majority scale, has gained majority support from the Japanese public. The government forbids the release of basic information about the death penalty. Executions are conducted in secret, as former Justice Minister Hideo Usui told them they're scheduled during parliamentary recesses so as to deprive opposition politicians of any opportunity to cause a big public row over the death penalty. So at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, number one, we think that death penalty still has a deterrence, but secondly, it harms the political capital of Shinzo Abe. Thank you.
Great that you have brought in the terrorism and organized crime into the picture. Are you aware that life isn't so important for terrorist organization members?
Yes.
So don't you think that loyalty to the group is paramount for those terrorists?
Yes.
So why would death penalty ever scare them if they would even suicide bomb themselves to begin with?
Because death penalty would automatically mean that they would lose their life inside prison and that they wouldn't be able to coordinate any more attacks outside prison.
So, what if we killed their leader? What do you think the rest of the member would do?
If you take away the leader, you only take a part of the terrorist organization. The rest of the organization works. You cannot expect the whole organization to fall just because the leader fell.
Perfect. So I think revenge is the only thing that the rest of the member would do. And why is that a good thing for you?
I never said it's a good thing. I never said that in my speech.
Okay, so since we know revenge is the only thing that the terrorist group will conduct after we kill their leader, how different are we if the state also prioritizes revenge over mercy to the criminals?
We're not prioritizing revenge. We're just saying that the most commensurate response that we have to these kinds of serial killers and terrorists is that we kill them right away rather than spread their ideology and prolong their life inside prison.
Mark, also, I just want to point out, our evidence also indicates that not all terrorists are motivated by the desire for revenge. And our evidence indicates that the fact that many terrorists who are caught petition for life without parole indicates that the premise that all terrorists want to die for their cause is incorrect.
Okay, enough of terrorists. So, are you aware that there's many prisoners wanted to kill themselves imprisoned?
Wanted what?
Kill themselves? Imprisoned.
Yeah.
So, don't you think a death penalty might be an even easier way out for these people?
It's an easier way out, precisely because inside prison cell, you have subhuman conditions. There's a high probability that you get ganged up by your inmates. There's a high probability that you get raped or even get killed by other prisoners.
Exactly.
Would you want that?
No, that's why I think life in prison inherently carries a better deterrence effect.
I don't think so.
Okay, also, again, so then the value. Don't you think if we keep one person fit and strong, work in the prison, for the rest of his life for us would be more useful than if we would just kill him?
The idea of prison in your paradigm seems to be very cute and very comfortable. The reality is brutal. What we have in prison conditions is that it's overcrowded, underfunded, people get ganged up.
Thank you.
There are a lot of blanket assertions made in the last speech. He just merely asserted that terrorists act and that there is a correlation. We present a piece of evidence in the first constructors that indicates there has been no correlation between terrorism and actual and capital punishment preventing that terrorism. He didn't point to a specific piece of evidence that contradicted this point. Therefore, I would like for you to extend that point across, and it means that it's very difficult for him to prove that terrorism happens as a result. Additionally, he didn't say why that matters more than human dignity or European relations. I would like you to keep that in mind throughout the speech because it will become very important when you have to evaluate this debate. The next argument he made, which was incoherent, was about politics and why Abe's nuclear power agenda is key. But he didn't isolate a reason why that nuclear power agenda is key, what it is key for, how it benefits the nation, or who it benefits, which is why you shouldn't evaluate it over clearly isolated impacts, things that will occur as a result of European relations decreasing and also the human dignity argument. Now I will go on to discuss the morally unjust argument. He has two arguments. His first argument is that deterrence actually decreases human dignity, and he said that without providing a reason of how that decrease in human dignity actually occurred. Our evidence indicates that when the state actually kills people, when the state engages in the same type of brutal violence that individuals do, it justifies that violence to reoccur. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. There was no response to this. It also means that violence will increase as a result of the death penalty because murderers, terrorists, whoever chooses to attack the state will continue to do so, and they'll also murder individuals. This means that we clearly isolate a way in magnitude where more lives will be lost compared to less lives with life without parole being an option. The second thing he says is that life without parole is treating people too nicely. That's not an argument. This is merely a statement. Life without parole, treating people too nicely, only justifies our argument about human dignity. No one will die as a result of life without parole happening. Life without parole is done in secrecy. They don't have any correspondence with people on the outside world. So there's no proof that it will actually lead to increased violence, which means that at the end of the debate, he hasn't provided a reason for deterrence to be preferred. Additionally, capital punishment will actually increase terrorism, as Cynthia alluded to in the cross-examination. According to Avatar in 2009, some of the men have not only proudly claimed responsibility for attacks, but have also said that they want to be executed and martyred. It's not clear in this case whether the death penalty would act as deterrence or an incitement to other potential terrorists. It is in the strategic interest of the United States to deny these most heinous al-Qaeda terrorists what they want most. Also, if you want to look at the pieces of evidence, they just say that terrorism is increasing. That card isn't specific to Japan. It doesn't isolate an instance in which terrorists are actually increasing right now in Japan or how you're more at risk. They also don't offer a way for them to be able to solve for terrorism even with the death penalty. He concedes that terrorism may still occur, but it may prevent less deaths, which means that terrorism is still a possibility in the world of the negative. Okay, so now I will discuss quickly the death penalty argument. The Zier card that Cynthia isolates, which was in 2007, indicates that the death penalty fuels the very phenomenon it claims to suppress, taking a life, whether on the streets or in the courtroom, is driven by the same motive to do justice. Both are parts of a cycle of violence that we must stop. Also on the European relations advantage. Now, Scott is going to come up here and he's going to tell you that there is no impact to the European relations, the European Union, and Japan. But there clearly is. Our first card that Cynthia actually reads from says that Japan's cooperation with the European Union is key to the protection of democracy and human rights. And that protection of democracy and human rights must be preserved in order to prevent the worst atrocities. So, for example, if Japan or the European Union weren't able to cooperate, if nations became dictatorships, lives would be worse off. More deaths will happen. Moral degradation will happen as a result of that, and that would be worse. Off. Also, our Pajoin in 2000, according to Pajoin in 2006. The improved Japanese-EU relations are also desirable due to things like trade. It's due to things like trade and the rule of law. Putting rule of law at the forefront, putting the protection of life in the states at the forefront is key to actually preserving democracy and the best stability for mankind and for Japan and the European Union. That is actually key to preserving stability for society, which means that they can access that by saying that they will be able to preserve stability by stopping the death penalty. Oh, for cross-examination.
Sir, if you were to choose between the right of life of an accused murderer versus the right of life of broader society, which one would you value more?
It's not my choice. It's the choice about if the state should have the right to decide if someone should live or not. It's not relevant. Rather, my individual choice would be for that person to live or not. And we isolate specific reasons why the state should not be able to kill people.
Do people not get killed if they get imprisoned for a lifetime inside prison?
Do people not get killed if they have a lifetime inside prison?
Yeah.
Well, obviously the people on death row wouldn't be killed. Yes, that's true.
Do you think that prison conditions are also inhumane and also undermine the dignity that you would want to protect on your side?
They may undermine that dignity, but I would advocate, especially in the following speeches, if you make that argument, that it is worse to kill people than it would be for them to have to suffer in prison.
regarding EU-Japan relations,
Yes.
are you aware of the bad economic condition right now in the EU? Yes or no?
There's a bad economic condition around the world, you're right.
Yep. So if that were
That's
the
why
case,
increasing trade and relationships are key.
yep, if that were the case, do you think that it's a rational move for EU to hold back any strengthening of its ties with Japan just because Japan wouldn't want to abolish its death penalty?
Sure, it may not be rational to me, but the EU has shown in the past that it's willing to castigate, to commit actions against Japan as a result of its death penalty policy. There have been several UN resolutions against Japan. The EU has voted against Japan on several measures in the UN. And we've seen in the past that it is fracturing the relationship. Also, that it prevents Japan and the European Union from working together on things like human rights and democracy, which are key to human dignity.
All right, that's all.
So Marlon just gave a very compelling speech. The unfortunate thing is it's very detached from what was actually said in the 1NC. And that's true for a couple reasons. One of the first things that Marlon said in his speech is that we didn't provide any evidence that capital punishment deters murder. Unfortunately for him, we did. Mark read a card from Professor Shepard from Emory University that indicates that the capital punishment deters every single kind of violent crime. And moreover, here's another piece of evidence that cites 7 different studies that says that capital punishment deters murder and violence. This is from Dudley Sharp, and it cites 7 different studies from Mo Khan, from Klonger and Marcheski, and from a number of other different authors that indicates that capital punishment will deter violent crime. And so the very basic premise of every single one of their arguments is proven incorrect. Moreover, Marlon also said that violence will inevitably reoccur. But it's important thing is to know that right now, violence is occurring anyway, even in states that don't have capital punishment. Violence is inevitable. The question is, do you want the state to commit it and potentially prevent additional murders? Or do you want violence to occur unimpeded with no chance of ever stopping it? Moreover, Marlon at the end of his speech also makes this argument at the European Union, saying that we need to increase cooperation. But cooperation is happening now. It's not like there is not cooperation between Japan and the European Union now. And they have not indicated how repealing the death penalty would in any way improve that cooperation. Until they do that, I don't know why you should buy the basic premise of their argument. Now, on the Japanese politics argument, Marlon was very dismissive of it. He said that it was incoherent. I don't think it was. I think it was actually pretty clear. Because this argument indicated that Abe is pushing for nuclear power now, and that the repeal of the death penalty would take away his political capital, which is to say his ability to push for new political causes. Now, we didn't read an impact to this argument in our 1NC, but I'll do that now. And that is that nuclear tech solves global warming. This is from WNA in 2007. Meeting increasing demand for electricity will require non-emitting sources, including nuclear power, taking an increasingly predominant role. The nuclear power plants operating in over 30 countries provide 15% of the world's electricity, avoiding the emission of over 2 billion tons of carbon dioxide each year, equals more than 20% of global CO2 emissions from power generation. And global warming will eventually cause extinction if we don't try to solve it. This is from Oliver Tickle in 2008. The idea that we could adapt at 4C rise is abrupt and dangerous. Global warming on this scale would be a catastrophe that would mean the end of living and the beginning of survival. Otherwise, our extinction. All the world's coastal plains would be lost. If we do not begin to adapt nuclear power, the world will end from global warming. Abe's ability to push for and adapt nuclear power is essential to preventing global warming. And getting rid of the death penalty will be so politically unpopular that he will not have the political capital to push for this type of program, which would obviously lead to the impact I just talked about. And the last thing I want to talk about is our deterrence argument. Now, Marlon made a number of different points on this, and I think that some of them are a little problematic. Now, he said that we didn't cite a correlation between the death penalty and deterrence. But as I already said, we did. We read a piece of Shepard evidence that indicates that terrorists, specifically, are deterred from committing crimes are committing acts because of the death penalty. And it indicates that many terrorists, when they're caught, will actually push for life in prison without parole. We assume that terrorists are these horribly irrational actors who just want to die for their cause. Unfortunately, this is detached from reality. Terrorists are still human beings, and even though they want to commit horrible, horrible acts, if they think that they're going to die, they are less likely to commit it. Now, Marlon says that violence will still occur and murders will still occur. But that's true whether you vote for the affirmative or the negative. Violence is still going to happen. People are still going to die. The question is, who better deters it? We've already shown the death penalty right now deters murder. It deters terrorism. It deters violence. It deters rape. We've read 2 pieces of evidence that indicate this. They haven't read any. The only piece of evidence they've read indicates that there aren't any studies that say that capital punishment deters murder. We cited 8 different studies that indicate this. Clearly, the evidence is on our side, and the truth is on our side. Moreover, he reads this piece of aviator evidence that talks about how terrorists are irrational and how the possibility of the death penalty would leave them to be more likely to commit these crimes. But our evidence actually answers this. Our arguments indicate that terrorists don't want to die. This aviator evidence just assumes that all terrorists are these horribly irrational people. But our Shepard evidence indicates that actually, in real life, terrorists do want life in prison without parole, which means the death penalty is more likely to deter their actions. And the last argument Marlon made is that our evidence about whether or not terrorism is increasing is not specific. This is just not true. Our one piece of evidence specifically says that Japanese citizens need to prepare for the prospect of terrorism occurring in their home country. Our evidence could not be more specific. It says literally exactly the thing he says it does not say. And so at the end of this round, you'll find a couple things. You'll find that capital punishment deters murder, and that murder on its own, regardless of who commits it, is unethical, which is a reason why you'll prefer us at the end of this debate. Thank you.
Ready to stop?
Yep.
How long does it take to build a nuclear power plant?
Well, I guess it depends. It takes some time.
Okay, give me an estimation for one nuclear power plant. How long does it take?
I don't have an estimation on how long it takes to build a specific plant.
Okay, sure.
A couple of years,
So,
maybe? A couple of years?
It takes a couple of years to build one nuclear power plant.
Yes.
How many nuclear power plants does it take to solve global warming?
We don't have a specific amount. Our evidence just indicates.
So you have no clue how long it would take to build.
I wasn't done answering
Okay,
your
go
question.
ahead.
Our evidence just indicates that a continual adoption of nuclear power is necessary to prevent global warming.
Sure, your evidence indicates that nuclear power plants will be built inside of Japan. Do you have a piece of evidence that indicates they would be built outside of Japan for large emitters like China, for instance?
Sure. So our evidence just indicates that the adoption of nuclear power in any instance is helpful in preventing global warming.
Sure, but it doesn't solve it. Like, where's your piece of solvency evidence that says that it will actually solve for global warming now?
Well, first of all, it's global warming in the future. And I think the second
How will
point
it
is...
solve global warming in the future, then?
Okay,
Answer both of the questions.
Okay, well, okay. So I think the basic premise is that the expansion of nuclear power in any instance, particularly in the industrialized world, will be beneficial to preventing global warming, particularly in any country that has massive carbon emissions, such as...
Japan is one of those countries?
Japan does have carbon emissions, yeah.
No, massive carbon emissions is what
Yes.
you said. Comparatively to what countries? Compared to what countries does Japan have large amounts of carbon emission?
Well, compared to non-industrialized countries?
Okay, that's fine. So, you solve for Japan.
Yes.
And the U.S. and China still emit. How does that solve global warming?
Sure. So we'll make the argument, and we'll be happy to read evidence on this later in the debate if you would like us to, that the adoption of nuclear power in particular industrialized countries leads to other industrialized countries also adopt nuclear power. It's a modeling argument that other countries, when they see that a form of energy...
But you haven't read that piece of evidence.
Not at this point, no.
So you're just claiming it during cross-examination. That's fine.
Well, you didn't make an argument against it yet, so...
Sure. Let's talk about the capital punishment deters terrorism Shepard card.
Yes.
What does this card actually cite? It seems to indicate that
Yes.
it is more likely that it would be able to stop some form of terrorism without giving specific examples of what instances of terrorism it stops. It says that in court they don't prefer life without parole.
Sure.
How does that
there's actually,
prove that it deters terrorists?
Yeah, so there's actually 2 points on this. So Shepard has done her own studies that indicate that in the instance where countries that have the death penalty when terrorists are tried there, that they seek life without parole. Moreover, it also indicates that there our sharp card indicates...
How does that prove that it deters terrorism, though?
Our sharp card cites an additional 7 studies that indicates that capital punishment
deters... It doesn't stop violence. The sharp card does. The first card is the only card that talks about terrorism.
Oh, well, the sharp card does indicate any sort of crime of passion, which terrorism would include.
The biggest problem, ladies and gentlemen, with affirmative is that they have been so detached from reality, the realities that are happening in our world, the reality that our world right now, although moving, in the words of Cynthia, towards a more humane and a more civilized society, is also a society that has become far more dangerous than it used to be in the past. Now, affirmative has just shown you an example of how to perfectly skirt an issue and disengage from the arguments we've just launched. We're going to show you an example of how to clearly settle these issues once and for all. Number 1, on the argument that, coming from them, that abolishing the death penalty would enhance EU-Japan relations. Our response to that is very simple. Number 1, it's already happening anyway. Number 2, EU, we think that it's highly presumptuous that just because Japan wouldn't abolish death penalty, EU will hold back any form of strengthening of its economic ties with Japan, especially now, considering that the Eurozone is in a crisis. You cannot expect EU to just forego of any economic opportunity right now when its people are dying, when its people are, experiencing hunger, when its people are tightening their belts just because they don't have money to buy food, right? We think that the current economic condition right now in Europe creates a massive incentive for EU to grab every single opportunity that could improve its economic condition rather than mind something such as a domestic policy of Japan that wouldn't have tangible benefit to EU, right? Number 2, on this argument, repetitive argument that the state has a moral obligation in protecting the life of every person. We agree, but our response to this is very simple. Protecting humanity isn't just about protecting the dignity of the accused, but protecting the dignity of every single life that you have in broader society, right? We think that the state, that on the part of the accused, it's even more dehumanizing on the part of the accused because you leave them vulnerable to a lot of the brutal realities that we have inside prisons, such as being treated like an animal, such as being ganged up by inmates, or worse, even raped by your fellow criminals, right? We think that if you really want to protect human dignity and that the state has a moral obligation in protecting human dignity, our policy is the best way to go. But on the level of broader society, we think that if the state has to choose between the dignity of an accused murderer and the dignity of the rest of the lives that you have in society, we think that it's perfectly rational for the state to choose more lives than the lives of an accused murderer, right? So now let's reinforce the arguments coming from Scott here. And it was very well argued from Scott here. Number 1, on deterrence, right?
Sorry, time.
All right, thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I have 4 things to talk about at the end of this debate. So, number 1 is how terrorism plays in today's debate. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's quite fairly simple, right? If a leader of Yakuza, or let it be Al-Qaeda or Lokudame Yamakuchigumi, being captured by the Japanese government, let it be anyone, right? So then, we already know when the life isn't the most important thing for the rest of the member, when we already clearly know killing their leader will only agitize the rest of the terrorist group, why do we want a further disabled society with more risk of terrorist attack, right? I mean, for Scott to come here and back and forth about, rationally speaking, terrorist fear of death, I think that argument itself just doesn't fly, because the whole point about terrorism is just they are not rational to begin with. Otherwise, they would talk instead of suicide bomb themselves. So we think that that argument just completely falls. So we think, and then he has this other interesting argument of how death penalty would help Japan to prepare for terrorism. Wait a second. I think death penalty happens after an attack. It's at most a post-attack remedy, if you think that is. But I think preventing terrorism might have been better if you implement higher security at airport, etc., things like that. And death penalty, given it's already a free go, and these people wanted to suicide bomb themselves to create chaos for society, I don't think that just creates any sort of further check and balance into the system. And then the third thing under the theme of terrorists is, like I asked in the question earlier, is how much better are we really going to be if Japanese government insists on revenge instead of rehabilitation, instead of just keep society safe? How much better are we if we keep the same focus of the rest of the terrorist group? We don't think so. And I don't think that's a stance that the affirmative side of this debate would happy to promote. So secondly, let's just talk about, and by the way, if you really want evidence, we have an evidence from Devaney Avitar from 2009, had a research under the topic of death penalty actually fear terrorism because they want to die. So if you're happy, discuss with my second speaker about that. Second is, well, let me talk about the whole life without parole, whether or not this deters people, whether or not this is enough to keep the society safe. Number one, how does this deter the particular individual who has committed the crime? I said it's very simple that these people has been segregated. And second, for general public, without horrible treatment, it's already enough. All right, so I'm just going to make the rest for Marlon to bring it out. Thank you.
Big problem in their last speech. They at no point actually talk about Japanese politics, which means they have conceded it totally, which means it is essentially a true argument, which means they have conceded that the passage of the plan will lead to Japan not adopting nuclear power, which will eventually lead to extinction. You may think that Japanese nuclear power might not have all that much of an effect, but if it has any chance of in any way diminishing global warming, it means that it helps to solve for the impact of extinction or some of the other negative effects of global warming. They never address it. So even if you think this argument maybe is a little far-fetched, you should still give it some weight because they didn't bother to even talk about it in their last speech. Now, on to the questions of deterrence. I think that there are a couple reasons why we're winning this. First of all, they barely cite any evidence at all in this debate. They only extend one piece of evidence in their last rebuttal, and it's this Aviatar card. And I mean, to be frank, this evidence is really, really terrible. It just has a blanket assertion. It doesn't have any sort of reasons why it's true. It just asserts that terrorists want to kill themselves. But first of all, think back to the 1995 terrorist attack on the subway in Japan. Those terrorists were not suicide bombers. They didn't kill themselves. So not every terrorist wants to die. Clearly, those people didn't want to die. I want you to extend our Shepard and our Dudley cards, which indicate that terrorists are deterred by the existence of the death penalty. When terrorists are caught, they plead. They beg for life without parole. Terrorists don't want to die. We can't just assume that they're these horribly irrational actors. Our evidence proves, we have cited 8 studies. It's just a fact that terrorism, or that the death penalty, not only deters terrorism, it deters murder, it deters rape, it deters any kind of violence. All of the evidence and all of the truth is on our side. They didn't cite anything in the last speech to indicate other than this. It's just true that the death penalty deters violence. Now, they do say that the state shouldn't be allowed to commit these acts of violence. But there's a simple truth here. Violence and murder is inevitable. The question is, do you want the average person on the street to be able to commit it unimpeded? Or do you want the state to selectively execute people for the purpose of deterring future acts of violence, it is better for us to execute the few to save the many. That is the choice. That is what we have to do. There is only one ethical choice. There is only one choice that saves lives, and that is to leave the death penalty in place and have it be a deterrent to terrorism, have it be a deterrent to murder, and have it be a deterrent to rape. Yeah, they really don't have any response to this. There's just no response to this argument. So, thank you.
They conceded a critical argument at the end of the debate. They conceded that the death penalty actually increases the amount of violence that happens at the end of the debate. He merely stands up and says that there are 8 studies cited without explaining what those studies actually say, and he provides the other reason, and he says that he has a specific study that says that terrorism is deterred as a result of the death penalty. Call for that evidence at the end of the round. It does not make that claim. The only thing that it indicates, the only fact in the piece of evidence, says that terrorists who were on trial preferred life without parole instead of the death penalty. That does not prove that it deterred terrorism. It proves that terrorists acted and preferred life without parole instead of the death penalty. That's no indication to conclude that terrorism will actually happen. Also, he said we didn't answer terrorism very well, which may be true, but he conceded a couple of key arguments. The first is that Japan can prepare in other ways in order to prevent terrorism, which goes completely conceded throughout this debate. The second thing is he conceded that right now, even if Japan enacted the death penalty, that it wouldn't actually prevent a terrorist attack. He only gives you one analogy, which is the 95 bombing, but he can't get away with that. His evidence was specific to Al-Qaeda. He extends that throughout the debate. You can't use an analogy about a group that your evidence doesn't assume. He says that Al-Qaeda's presence is rising around the world now. If Al-Qaeda's presence is rising around the world, and there's a strong correlation between people wanting to die for martyrdom who are part of Al-Qaeda, it means that it will only fuel further terrorism. This completely turns his terrorism argument, and it is a reason to vote for the affirmative because it is the only way presented in this round to prevent future instances of terrorism when he only presents a false analogy to traditional forms of terrorism that weren't post 9/11 terrorism. The other thing that he says is that we do not directly refute his global warming analysis. Well, even if we did not address it directly, he didn't explain how it actually solves global warming. He merely says Abe pushing for nuclear power now will solve global warming without explaining how many nuclear power plants it would take, how long it would take to provide to solve for global warming. Cross-examination was damaging on this because he hasn't provided a way that other countries, the largest polluters, would actually model. The only thing that I need to win at the end of the debate, remember, is that terrorism is more likely and more violence will happen as a result of the death penalty. He conceded the first piece of evidence that says violence will actually increase as a result of the death penalty. And he also conceded that Al-Qaeda attacks and want to be executed, so they will be more of martyrs.